supposed to be the envy of the world throughout the West. It's certainly under attack. We don't have Congress doing much to protect free speech, to protect the First Amendment, to rein in corporations who might be targeting people or harassing people because of their political views, because of their political messaging, as happened in this case. It's a very grim situation, and it doesn't seem to be getting better anytime soon.
Let's go, Brandon.
Not just slogans on masks raising free speech issues, the Spotify has announced that podcasts that contain COVID-related content will now get flagged up. It's after a number of musicians demanded the streaming giant cancel popular comedian Joe Rogan, who they accuse of spreading disinformation about vaccines. Party Saskia Taylor looks at how the simplest aspects of life are becoming political.
It was the best of podcasts, it was the worst of podcasts. Yet again, Joe Rogan has landed himself bang in the middle of a culture war.
Misinformation and making money off of it. Disinformation, I should say. Joe Rogan has been at the center of controversy.
I mean, I agree that Joe Rogan is a horror.
They can have Rogan or Young, not both. Maybe it's me, but that's an easy choice.
Yes, Neil Young, maybe just really into vaccines, or maybe, as critics say, just looking for the relevance he lost way back in the 1970s. Top Spotify, it's me or Joe.
I'm doing this because Spotify is spreading fake information about vaccines, potentially causing death to those who believe the disinformation being spread by them.
And the young Spotify execs, after Googling who Neil Young is, and then remembering how they spent $100 million on exclusive rights to the most popular podcast in the world, pretended to think long and hard about it, before saying, sorry Neil, but we'll take the unvaxxed guy who makes us super rich and trends on Twitter. It was nice knowing you though.
We have detailed content policies in place, and we've removed over 20,000 podcast episodes related to COVID-19 since the start of the pandemic. We regret Neil's decision to remove his music from Spotify and hope to welcome him back soon.
So Young set out to cancel someone and ended up being cancelled himself. A true 21st century tragedy. Following in Young's footsteps, fellow 70s folk legend Joni Mitchell, doctors, and even the World Health Organization chief all took a swing at Spotify. So what's he said that's wound people up? Well, it's rather who he's been speaking to. Shall we be polite and call them vaccine skeptics? But then he went too far and invited Jordan Peterson, the professor on every liberal's most wanted list. And since we're being polite, let's just say that some of the views expressed were controversial.
I am white. Actually, that's a lie, too. I'm kind of tan. And he was actually not black. He is sort of brown.
There's no such thing as climate, right? Climate and everything are the same word.
An episode that sent people into a frenzy. But not Rogan. He's chilled. After all, he brings in 11 million listeners every single day. And apparently they like hearing alternative views. So he's given the Proud Boys, conspiracy theorists, Elon Musk, black conservatives, whistleblowers. Anyway, Rogan's not worried. And he might not be a legitimate source of medical information, but he is the most popular podcaster in the world. Untouchable. He knows that even the people he's clashed with on his own show can't help but love him.
He and I disagree about a lot, but I would rather engage with deeply enthusiastic, deeply curious people who I think are mistaken about many things, than only ever hear from people whose opinions I already understand.
So what have we learned from this latest episode of the Joe Rogan Experience? Well, he might be a persona non grata, but everyone still wants to be Rogan's bestie. The First Amendment, just clinging on. Joe Rogan, way too big to cancel. On Spotify, very, very greedy.
Well, as for Joe Rogan, he says the perception that people have of him is simply based on disparaging headlines. We spoke to the daughter of one of Rogan's latest guests, who you just heard Saskia talk about there, the prominent clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson. She questions the outrage over the podcast.
Stifling people's freedom of speech is more dangerous than allowing people to speak. And I mean, Joe Rogan is a comedian, right? So people watching his podcast should be aware that he comes at all these ideas about COVID and climate and whatever that's being discussed as a curious comedian. He's not an expert. I think he poses an actual danger to the mainstream narrative. So most of the news stations people see all say the same thing. They all have one way of thinking. And Joe Rogan, not that he's an expert in any of these areas, but he talks to whoever he wants and he puts forth a narrative that isn't mainstream. You can't stop people from talking about these ideas anyway because it increases curiosity. right? So just the whole thing about stifling free speech doesn't work. So it's silly to do, it's dangerous to do, and I don't think it's effective.
Now, he may have a mails from the province
Lindsay.
running around at home, but the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is looking to solve issues further afield. He said that he could send more troops to NATO forces in Eastern Europe, but at the same time is seeking talks with Libya officials to improve relations as the situation over Ukraine continues. As Auntie Daniel Hawkins explained to me earlier.
Well, it was just last week that Downing Street said the Prime Minister is determined to both accelerate diplomatic efforts and ramp up deterrence against Russia. And it seems the latter is coming first. The UK has planned to double its troop presence in Estonia, where currently around 1,000 soldiers, increasing that to 2,000 or so. Part of a NATO task force, thousands of soldiers placed across Eastern Europe through the Baltic states, Poland and Romania as well. And that follows similar announcements, of course, by Joe Biden just last week, who said he would be ramping up troop presence, US troop presence in Eastern Europe, including 8,500 soldiers on standby for Ukraine. And for this week, the UK Parliament will be legislation that will allow the government to target Russian banks, energy companies, and also oligarchs close to the Kremlin in order to deter what they describe as a Russian hostility.
This package would send a clear message to the Kremlin. We will not tolerate their destabilizing activity, and we will always stand with our NATO allies in the face of Russian hostility.
Well, diplomatic efforts are still ongoing. Indeed, Boris Johnson will have a phone call with Vladimir Putin in the coming days to travel alongside Boris Johnson this to the meeting, including to the Ukrainian capital Kiev, in an apparent effort to give diplomacy a final chance.
The Prime Minister directed the Foreign and Defence Secretaries to prepare to go to Moscow for talks with their counterparts in the coming days. They will be asked to improve relationships with President Putin's government and encourage de-escalation.
Well, quite contradictory messages there. Improving relations, de-escalation while deploying troops, perhaps would confuse many, including, it seems, the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, who said in recent days that he wanted Western leaders, not Moscow or Russia, but Western leaders to tone down their rhetoric of an imminent Russian threat, an imminent Russian invasion, stating that this sort of language simply was panic, destabilization, and damages the Ukrainian economy.
What about Johnson's critics? Plenty of them around at the moment. They'll point to what Johnson's doing to try and play hard with Russia as just a tool to try and deflect from the Partygate scandal. Is anybody buying what he's selling?
Boris Johnson is very much on fire, not just from the opposition, but from his own party. He's had defections, he's questioning just how tenable his position really is. He's had seen the biggest fallen for resignation. He also, of course, faces the official inquiry, the outcome of that inquiry of Officer Gray, the police criminal investigation into media headlines, promise questions, even in the polls. The Labour Party has taken, for the first time in years, a significant lead over the Tories, showing just how much the public has been affected by this scandal. And critics are saying increasingly this talk of a Russian threat or Russian invasion is a bit of a diversion, gives the Prime Minister some breathing space from these domestic problems.
Boris Johnson says he's helping with the diplomatic situation in Russia and Ukraine. He has no credibility. No one trusts him. The best thing he can do to help would be to resign.
He will travel to Moscow or wherever he's going in Europe this week. But everyone will know that he's a man with a time bomb sitting under him.
Now, it's clear to see no side wants to see diplomacy fail there. No move benefit from rising energy prices, unstable markets, currency fluctuations, neither Moscow, Europeans or Ukrainians. What is clear, though, is that by sending these sorts of mixed messages, Boris Johnson, according to some, certainly is decreasing the chances of a diplomatic solution or compromise, rather than increasing the chances of seeing eye to eye and finding a compromise with Moscow.
An international affairs commentator, Marco Gasic, also suspects Boris Johnson's trying to use the situation to his own advantage.
Boris Johnson seems to be trying to appeal to two audiences. He wants to talk about improving relations with Moscow in order to satisfy those who don't want us to be sleepwalking into a major conflict. At the same time, for Vox in the audience, he wants to make the point that he's sending more troops into a potential conflict region. On the domestic front, Boris is in a series of wars and conflicts which are extremely unpleasant to him. What better way to to remove the focus from those than to appear to be somewhat of a strong potential war leader in a foreign conflict, not one that has ever occurred, but one that is being suggested to be likely or possible to occur. Boris Johnson's aim is to use a story of a potential foreign conflict to distract attention from the real conflict and the real internal wars being waged against his reputation in the United Kingdom. So he will use his external clout to anesthetize domestic opposition to his premiership. That's the plan anyway. We'll see how it works.
The US have closely coordinate their devastating sanctions against Russia. Washington said it won't make its plans clear so that Moscow doesn't have a chance to limit the damage. And of course, to punish Russia for the situation in Ukraine rising across Europe as well. Raghav Diev next has been taking a closer look at who's likely to lose the most in the sanctions game. The United States, the European Union, are putting the final touches on a sanctions list so horrendous they promise no one's seen the like in decades. They expect an eye for an eye, that Moscow will follow suit and turn off the gas taps, for example, exacerbating what is already a global energy crisis. No matter how many times Russia has said that it will restrict gas supply. And so bureaucrats are off scurrying about trying to figure out how they'll survive if they implement their own sanctions.
We are collaborating with governments and market operators on supply of additional volumes of natural gas to Europe from diverse sources across the globe. Liquefied natural gas in the short term can enhance security of supply while we continue to enable the transition of net zero emissions. The European Commission will work for improved transparency and utilization of liquefied natural gas terminals in the EU.
This is impossible in the short term. It's Russian natural gas, which makes up a third of what Europe needs, is cut off entirely. You can't make up for it. Every day, Russia supplies Europe with 17 billion cubic feet of natural gas. For reference, the United States exports in total to everyone about 10 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day. So if the United States sent all of its natural gas to Europe, it still wouldn't be enough to fill the void. The Europeans aren't stupid. They understand this simple fact.
Germany needs a reliable energy supply that does not depend on a single pipeline, such as Nord Stream 2. The consequences of an escalation of the conflict would be grim for everyone. So it's right to talk to each other through any suitable channels to prevent an escalation.
And we haven't even begun to talk about price. Some European nations, such as Germany, pay a quarter of the market price for Russian natural gas. American gas would cost them 4 times as much for the same quantity. Market price. This is in the middle of winter, at a time when energy prices in Europe have doubled, have tripled, and quadrupled over the past year. At a time when you see headlines about Europeans having to choose between heating and food.
The European Union, like many other regions in the world, is currently facing a sharp spike in energy prices. This is a high concern for citizens, businesses, European institutions and governments all over the EU. The European Commission wants to help and support addressing the negative impact on households and businesses as a priority.
And that was before they put together a sanctions list so horrendous that they honestly expect Russia to cut off the gas and perhaps even the oil. A sanctions list so horrendous they themselves don't even know what it comes with.
We can't preview every action, but we intend there is to have measures that we think will create Russia's industrial capabilities and industrial production capacity over time, not to go after individual everyday Russian consumers.
The United States, the Europeans have said time and time again that they want to avoid sanctioning Russian energy so that the supplies keep feeding Europe. Chances are, of course, that nothing will come of this. Russia remains adamant that a war, whether it triggers those sanctions or not, will be senseless. And it has no plans to invade Ukraine.
This is nonsense. Why should Russia stop the delivery of gas? It's a nonsense from economical point of view, and it also didn't happen in history. This is only an interest of the United States, because the United States wants to sell their this area will achieve gas from Russia will be cut off. First, we would have a demand which wouldn't be covered. We would get problems, we would get the energy crisis, sanctions, with European
There's a line somewhere behind mine or something he was supposed to. They offered it to him, or I think Trudeau wanted him to do it. And then support.
We've been looking into recent joint research conducted in Italy and Russia.
It shows something extremely interesting happening. That is capable of medicine immunity. Not only do the vaccines try to build up also the microbiome. So this is the most important aspect. And realize that vaccines such as Sputnik are the easiest to deploy for logistic reasons. So you can use it to Sputnik. It's very practical. Vaccines, you can use it as a standalone vaccine, or it can also as a booster vaccine in combination. This is called a mixed approach with other vaccine. I don't think that the vaccine needs more evidence because the government can freely try to massive that doesn't really people. So we know it performs in the general population, but the individual domestic needs we may avoid diseases. So I don't know at what stage all advanced is the same. And the analysis by the analysis certainly need to be accelerated. Vaccination is certainly a very important tool that is in combination with sanitary measures, distancing, hygiene solutions. 3 doses in certain ways is all very often imaginable. There is immediate and maximum immediate of 3 doses. So let's see what happens. We don't have enough backup. No, you see. But we have to complete the 12 days so that we know what the second booster will be sufficient to induce immunity at least for some duration. That could be critical in the root of this pandemic.
And that's it for me. Where are you doing this Monday? Hope you have a great start to the week. And in the next few hours, Nicky Evans going to be here to keep you updated, followed by Kevin round off this January the 31st. Bye. Identify the threats that we have. Confrontation, Latvian arms race. Responsible threats. Very dramatic development. Personally, I'm going to resist. Let's see how that strategy will be successful. Very good. Time to sit down and talk. Enough truth seem wrong. Just don't hold. And if the world is yet to shake out, disdain becomes the attitude, and engagement equals betrayal. When so many find themselves worlds apart, we choose to look for common ground. Attention, and you're watching a special edition of Going Underground, 54 years since the Tet Offensive, a turning point against US wars in the Vietnam region that killed 6 million as American forces fought that war to make the world safe for capitalism. In America, the youngest mayor of a major US city was waging his own war against unrestrained corporate power, targeting his city of Cleveland. His stand against the privatization of the publicly owned Mooney Light Company echoes fights all around the world against neoliberalism. Joining me now from Cleveland is that Mayor Dennis Kucinich, former Democratic nominee for the US presidency and author of The Division of Light and Power. Dennis, thanks so much for finally being on Going Underground. I should just start by the fact that we're being warned here in London that Vladimir Putin might turn the light and power off in Europe. Your thoughts on the fact that NATO are briefing we are on the brink of war in Europe and that Biden is preparing thousands of troops to fight a war with Russia?
I can tell you here from American side, I'm talking to you from a neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio, and no one around here is thinking or talking about war. People are just trying to live their own lives, get through the pandemic, find a way to survive in this economy, and I think that people in Cleveland are pretty typical of most Americans. I think our country needs to finally come to a entente with Russia, resolve the underlying issues, which really can. What's interesting is that Michael arises at a time that there's a contest for control of energy markets of oil, natural gas, and anytime you have that kind of a struggle, there's always the possibility that people will do whatever they can in order to achieve dominance. And so we have to be very careful here in the States how we're reaching. And the world really is seeking for a way to come to peace. And the saber rattling right now that's going on, I don't think serves any country well, particularly those in Europe. And I think the United States, Mr. Biden, Mr. Putin, need to be in constant contact and lower the gesture right now, because I don't think anybody really wants more. I can't imagine that anyone thinks that they're any winners in such a conflict.
I mean, there's literally talk of comparisons to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Well, it has to be kept in mind that Russia's troop movement are happening within the Russian borders. I think that really needs to be understood. And Russia just has, any sovereign nation has the right to defend its own borders. I think the hysteria that's being whipped up needs to be discounted mightily in light of the fact that there are various agendas that are seeking to be advanced in the name of security, which actually, when they're unmasked, you can see that it, in a way, it's kind of a naked attempt to grab energy markets. And we have to be very careful about that. I think that there needs to be a genuine effort to repair the United States relationship with Russia.
But one of those agendas is privatization, and I'm not sure about Cleveland, but here in London, where I'm speaking to you from, often it's been talked about.
In 1985, UNESCO.
Now, Jim.
This thing can't be good for our eyes. When you invest on oil, be no advice to protect you.
Hi everyone, it's Dr. Ron, and welcome back to this YouTube channel on all things related to understanding narcissism and what these relationships do to us. It's my hope that this content will sort of alleviate some of your confusion and help you make sense of a very toxic mindset. So we're going to continue talking about the red flags for narcissism. Remember, red flags, early detection system. Pay attention. Have you ever noticed this happen with somebody who's narcissistic? They get bent out of shape when they realize that they're not special. And again, this red flags is meant to be a way, especially in a new narcissistic relationship, to pay attention to patterns and learn about patterns that are telling you early on that this relationship can be. Now, I'm going to say a quote. I've said it, I think, a couple times on this channel. I'm going to say it again. It's actually so not exactly high culture. But I think there are always some interesting gems in those damn Pixar films. So I have to watch for years. At one point, there's a sort of sad character in Incredibles named Syndrome. And he says something to the general effect of, if everyone is special, then no one is. It was interesting. Syndrome, the character, had some of the feel of a vulnerable narcissist. He wanted to be a superhero, so I think he tried to make some special boots or something like that to have superpowers. But the actual superheroes were inborn superpowers, and he was forever resentful of not being seen for his superness and the privileges the super people had. And he just got more and more angry and kind of made a mess out of everything. I think to his point of rage. The line stuck with everyone's special and no one is, because obviously one from a sort of happy rainbow place, kind of a very joyful unicorn place, could argue that everyone is special and unique. But perhaps maybe the true anti-narcissism line is, even if everyone is in their own way special, everyone should be treated the same and subjected to the rules in the same way. Now, the core of entitlement, and going one step further, entitlement is one of the cores of narcissism, is that someone believes that they are special. In fact, more special than others. And as a result, they should be accorded certain privileges that other people don't get. And that may mean that they believe the rules apply differentially to them. They should not be punished if they do bad things the same way others should be punished if they do those bad things, or the rules should apply to other people, but not to them. There is an inherent hypocrisy and delusion built into entitlement. When a narcissistic person's entitlement gets challenged, and a narcissist is not being seen as special, then shame and inadequacy get back to them, and rage always follows. So as a red flag, this idea of not being special can come out in a few ways. Some of this resonates with another concept that we've already talked about as being a red flag for narcissism, which is their inability to cope and their reactivity in situations in which they are frustrated, or disappointed, or stressed. At the time those things happen, it's a sort of reminder that they aren't special, right? It's only ordinary people like frustrated. I shouldn't have to with that. But the red flag of not being special, especially in the earlier phases of a relationship, can come out in a variety of ways. For example, when they're early in a friendship or relationship, ways it can come up is that they have to wait in line with everyone else, even when they are a regular or a VIP at a given business. When they don't get to board and airports ahead of other passengers. When they don't get that special label open spot when people the building. When they're not able to get into the nightclub or other hot spot as some sort of person at the door deciding who is getting in or not. When I am talking about special, I'm not talking about the specialness that is related to human uniqueness, or for example, doing something that's very special and kind, like making someone special homemade birthday cake. By special, I mean it the way narcissistic people see it. That they are so special that they should get special privileges and perks that other people don't get. I guess other people don't get to get because they're not so special. So when that specialness balloon gets popped because the narcissists are treated like everyone else, look at it. The things that follow tend to be rage, irritability, reactivity, maybe all kinds of other sort of noisy, clangy, reactive behaviors. Things like, I'm going to write a terrible review online about you. I'm going to put something on social media. Or some of those other kinds of dominant, shaming, posturing behaviors. Things like, when I'm done, you're going to be out of business because nobody's ever going to want to come up here again. Or they will threaten to file grievances or lawsuits to punish you because they weren't treated as though they are special. This whole idea of being special, red flag, can also be activated in a different direction. If they feel someone is being seen as more special than them. As you know, I'm based in Los Angeles, the celebrity mothership, and so people's belief in their specialness is on steroids in LA. According to a marketing narcissist, who may not be famous, but a little famous, may watch a much more famous or renowned or notorious person getting the VIP treatment somewhere, being quickly ushered into the restaurant, getting the best table in that place, or a private table, lots of people taking pictures of them, and the narcissistic person watching this scene unfold may actually literally have a visceral reaction to watching someone else be the special one. It doesn't even have to be on this grandiose scale. It may be that in line at that business, where the narcissistic person regularly goes to do whatever, then they're being made to stand in line. But to watch that someone else, who may be more important to the business or for some other reason, someone else actually does get to jump the line. Again, what you're often likely to see is a rage fire show. That happens either passive-aggressive rage or overt rage. It's almost a 1-2 punch. Not only is the narcissistic person seeing that they are not the special one, but on top of that, it turns out that someone else is. Now, in my life, for a variety of reasons, I have to fly a lot. I used to do it more before the pandemic, but even during the pandemic, I still have to fly out. And for me, airports are like narcissism laboratories. Entitlement is always on display. How people board the aircraft, how they store their bags once they get on the aircraft, how they manage their arm wrestling, the leading of the seats, how they behave when they didn't get their way on the airplane or when they're boarding the airplane, and how they behave in the rushed experience of the airport or in the rather tight, uncomfortable confines of the airplane. When people's specialness was not being recognized, then that is when we'd see more of this angry behavior emerging. There's actually very interesting research out there that shows that when people have to walk through the first class cabin to get to the coach cabin, that there are more incidents of air rage on those flights than if the coach passengers board right into the coach panel. My guess is that those folks who are gracefully acting out on flights, probably narcissistic types, if they saw that others had bigger seats and better stuff, then you're not the special little trigger that's activated, and then they go off on their fellow coach passengers. Right? Now, to identify this red flag, look for things in a person like them bristling at rules that everyone else has to follow, having contempt for rules that have been set, and always trying to find a way to work around those rules or skirt them or bend them or break them. Asking to speak to the manager or other authority figure if they aren't getting their way. The person's volume rising as they try to get their specialness seen, or a lot of sullen, mighty rage if they're not being seen. Also pay attention how they may be reacting to someone else getting special treatment. Is there anger, disparagement, contempt, or a disproportionate reactivity if they see someone else getting better treatment than them? If the rules are bent for everyone, then why should we even have them? We are definitely in an era of entitlement, where everyone thinks that the rules are great for everyone else, just not for themselves. And if we do that, that's what we can. But the bad behavior that can follow confirmation that in a given situation that someone is not special can be a very important red flag to pay attention to. So if you're in a new kind of friendship or relationship, you see that somebody gets bent out of shape and they're not the special one, file that away. Therefore, not content with the narcissistic situation. Thanks again.
Oh.
Narcissistic abuse is not widely understood, yet it is extremely prevalent. So many people suffering from it are suffering in silence. Mental educator and clinical psychologist Dr. Ramani is on the forefront of research and treatment for narcissistic abuse. The pattern of psychological neglect and invalidation that its victims face is difficult to recognize and even more difficult to reconcile. But Dr. Ramani has the education you need to do both. In this series, she shares how to spot the signs of narcissistic abuse, how to help a friend or a loved one suffering from it, how to leave a relationship with a narcissist, and more. In our first session, she unpacks the baseline knowledge you need on narcissistic abuse. Dr. Ramani, it's our favorite topic, narcissism. For those who don't know you, why don't you give them a quick background on who you are?
I'm Dr. Ramani Vasala. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm a professor of psychology, and I'm an author. And I've actually written one, and a book is just about to come out. It's like the second book on narcissism, why it's not good for us, how it's hurting our lives, our hearts, our souls, our world. Since the next book really takes on the big articulations of like, this is everywhere. It's almost as if something seeped into the water supply. It's making everyone sick. And many people say, I don't have something like this in my life. Oh, yes, you do, because you go to the grocery store, because you get on an airplane. This is happening around you, even if it's not targeting you directly. Something looking on the social media feed and having to see all this, it's taking a toll on people. And then, of course, obviously, people in these relationships. It is, I mean, as you can imagine, in my relationship with MedCircle, we started a journey. My journey with MedCircle started talking about this issue. You know, I mean, I know these videos have gotten millions of hits. I mean, I get so many emails every day. This is a problem all over the world. People are suffering. Yeah. Like, this is a rallying cry. I mean, this isn't okay. So I really devoted my career at this point to this.
What I think is happening is that people are finally understanding what it is that they're dealing with.
Yes.
When I first sat down with you, I was learning about narcissistic personality disorder and traits of narcissism, and then I was able to see in my life where that was showing up. Where before I would have said, oh, this person just rubs me the wrong way, but now I have understanding behind it, and that understanding allows me to cope with it.
It does, but I have to tell you, there's a pattern of grief you see in people who say, what is this? I feel like I'm going crazy. Oh, that's what this is. Oh, it can't change. your entire world, now your entire world you have to change. Because some people might have spent 10 weeks, 10 months, 10 years, 25 years trying to change this person. I'm saying, and so people will say, thank you so much. I'm so glad I'm not pushing the boulder up the hill anymore. And then they see the pattern for what it is. You can't unsee the pattern. And it not only makes them, it fills them with, again, sometimes grief, regret. And then they have to turn their game around, right? They can, there's skills we can share with people how they can manage this. But then what a lot of people said, once I start seeing this, I can't not see it. And it makes people more discerning in terms of how they let people into their lives. Personally, I've been more than once called out as like, oh gosh, you're really hard on people. I notice you distance from someone right away. And I'll notice everyone else giving that narcissistic person a chance. So in essence, enabling that person, giving them an audience.
That was big. Giving them a chance, in essence, enabling them. That's good, because if we're talking about enabling a drug addict, people will go, I get it, I won't do that. This team that we're on purpose, enabling them, giving them a chance.
And so then if I'm the only one in the room was like, being not cool. The vibe here, the energy here is wrong. And I think only people who have survived narcissistic abuse sometimes get it. They're not strong, but I get it. And then sometimes the survivor of narcissistic abuse gets called out for being dismissive, for being mean. I mean, it really do. It's almost like they're re-abused, re-traumatized. And what's been ironic, I guess, I think I'm pompous when I admit this, when I will pull back and say, yeah, no, this person's not cool. And then everyone's like, oh, it's just listening to them, and you're not. And then they get burned by that. And then, of course, these people coming back like, you're right about that. Or I said, you can yourself 6 months and a lot of money.
Absolutely. This series is all about narcissistic abuse. We've talked about narcissistic personality disorder because really for the people who are in an abusive relationship. And this can go beyond romantic relationships. This can be friends, family, bosses, etc. What is narcissism? What is a narcissist?
Okay, so a narcissist, we're going to get more from lots of different videos on this too, but a narcissist is a person who has a long-standing pattern of not having empathy, being very grandiose, being arrogant, being entitled. They tend to be very superficial. They're constantly seeking admiration and validation. They cannot tolerate frustration or disappointment, and under those conditions, they often explode in these big rages. They tend to be very dishonest. They can often be very controlling. Now, to get a holistic view of a narcissist, though, not all of them look like the big, pumped up, grandiose, like, here I am, and I'm so great. There's also a flip side to narcissism, which is that very covert, vulnerable side. And these are people who they tend to be very resentful, sullen, angry, mopey. They feel that the world's not fair. They feel the world's not just. I never got my chance. I'm one of the great ones. That can actually sometimes be very dangerous for narcissism because they're sort of sullen and brooding, and they feel like life is never right to them. They often walk around very much a victim mentality. Those are the two faces of narcissism. And in the same narcissist, you can have both. It really depends on how your life is going. And it's macro, whether you're vulnerable or whether you're grandiose. Both forms of narcissism are really about that lack of empathy, that entitlement, that arrogance. Somehow, they're too good for you, they're too good for the world, they can't be bothered with other human beings, they just don't care.
What's the difference between someone who is narcissistic and someone who has a narcissistic personality disorder?
The big difference is more of a technical issue. So whenever we talk about a disorder, we talk about a lot of disorders on Med Circle. One of the key issues is that the person is experiencing either some kind of impairment or distress due to their behaviors or their symptoms. A classical example would be somebody, for example, who's depressed. The person who's depressed is at irregular sleep, and they feel sad, and they can't concentrate, and they feel worthless. They're uncomfortable. And on top of that, it's probably causing them problems at work, in their relationships, and their lives. That impairment, distress idea makes sense there. All of us have sad days. But the idea that the sadness and how long it lasts and it gets in the way of our lives, that's when we diagnose it as major depressive disorder. And narcissistic personality, here's where it gets tricky. A lot of people with these patterns have no impairment. They're getting promotions, they're getting the girl or the guy. Everyone's thinking they're so cool. I want them at my party. They're all very financially successful. So as far as they're concerned, they're killing it.
Right.
So where's the impairment and distress? You're saying, I ain't got a problem. It's your problem. It's their problem. It's the world's problem. They defend themselves. They rationalize everything. They compartmentalize. The world almost exists for their convenience. So they're not distressed. And depending on what index you use, they're not impaired. Now, there's nowhere in our diagnostic manuals we diagnose someone because they make other people unhappy.
Right.
That's not built into the
Yeah, just
model.
because you're a jerk doesn't mean you get a diagnosis.
That's right. We do not diagnose jerks. And I think a lot of people wish we did, because I think the call, email I get most often from clients is, please give him a diagnosis. And I say, no. And why? I mean, he's a jerk. You've established it. I believe you. I'm buying it. You know, somehow, and I'm thinking, there's no pill. I can see where you want to diagnose it. But listen, honey, if I had the narcissism pill, I'd be shooting MedCircle videos on my yacht.
Thank you.
In San Tropez.
Thank you.
Okay,
Yes.
so the fact is there is no pill. And I think that people want, they're so hurt. They want this to go away. So narcissistic personality disorder, we only see it in maybe 1 to 5% of people. Narcissism, I'm willing to tip that number over 50% at this point. 50%. I really do have to say, I'd be certain for like playing field. Maybe I'm wrong, but I can see it like in my inner circles.
You live in the capital.
I live in the capital, true, that's
Los
fair.
Angeles.
And I 50% is a bit much. You can catch me on a bad day. But I have to say,
I've had a lot of friends watch your series on narcissism or your many videos, and a lot of them text me. They go, "Oh my gosh, you're connected to narcissists." Why do you say that? And they start explaining why they think that. And you're not getting it then.
yes, and you know what? Some people watch those videos and they say they're a narcissist, and they're kind of right. They'll say like, yeah, I don't really listen to other people's problems. I can't be bothered, and I'll want to get to the core of what is this contempt about, and frame it for them. Do you realize that the core of intimacy and the core of closeness is sometimes you listen to things, maybe you're not fully plugged in, but you care about them as a person. So listen, if some narcissists are unearthing their narcissism, great. It becomes a teaching point. It becomes a self-reflective point on whether they're hurting other people. I've worked with lots of narcissists in therapy. I can only get them so far.
What is narcissistic abuse, and why do narcissists abuse?
So narcissistic abuse is not a well-articulated phenomenon. Those of us who do talk about it haven't even come up with a standardized definition. To me, it is a pattern of psychological neglect, invalidation, dehumanization that causes significant stress or psychological harm or distress to the individual who is the subject of such abuse. And this abuse, what it's characterized by, is chronic invalidation, lack of compassion, lack of respect, lack of what we call mutuality, back and forth, and a sort of a cold indifference on the part of the narcissist to the other person. Like I said, it's not a truly well-articulated phenomenon, though a lot of us talk about it. That's sort of what it looks like. People who are on the receiving end of narcissistic abuse, at the most severe, some of these clients, I think they look like they almost have post-traumatic stress disorder. At the less severe end, you see people who are full of self-doubt, anxiety, they don't feel good about themselves, they worry a lot, they feel hopeless, they feel helpless more than anything else. And all of those patterns make them less efficient and less able to get through their day-to-day lives. It hurts their relationships, it hurts them at school, it hurts them at work. So if anything, the people who are narcissistic aren't experiencing the distress and impairment. The people who are experiencing their abuse are.
So why do they do this to people that they say they love and care about?
When you ask that question, kind of gets too complicated. Because number one, what is love? Okay, so and we do and we don't. I think that's a key. Because a lot of people say, he says he loves me. How can he do this? He must not love me. I'm like, slow down, sister. He said he loves you. You're going to have to buy that. Here's the problem. This thing he's selling is love. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. So some people go to bars and give you a glass of wine. What the hell is this?
It could just be grape
it could
juice.
just be grape juice, right? So, in some ways, when narcissists are in love, it's sort of like the grape juice of wine. It's something very superficial. It is something that lacks the depth that a healthy, intimate relationship has. It tends to be what we call very instrumental. And in that way, narcissists view human relationships as conveniences. So in other words, it's like this cup. Right now, I like this cup because it's going to give me what I want to drink. Okay, very convenient. I'm actually quite focused on it now. In 10 minutes, I'm not going to get this cup the second thought because I need it. That's how narcissists treat people. I get that. And so that's really why it is. That's sort of the core of why it happens. It's just this disregard, and they just don't get. But they think they love because they may pay the rent. They might buy you gifts. They may take you out to dinner. I took you on vacation. I came to your sister's wedding. What more do you want from me? And so, as far as they're concerned, that's love. Which is why I've always said, on around the 10th day, you need to put your love contract down and say, sweetheart, this is what love is to me. And if you ain't buying, that's fine. But I really do think that people need to be clear. But how many people are going to walk around saying, my definition of love is actually quite superficial, and this is the way you need to stay at, and this is how I expect things to be, and I promise you this much in rent, this much in stuff, this much in gift. That's kind of gross and transactional, but for narcissists, a lot of new relationships are often quite transactional.
Lots to unpack. Well, are you sipping wine or just sipping grape juice? In our next session, we're going to talk about the signs of narcissistic abuse in your partner. I'm share with you today a technique that correct. I'm going to share with you today a technique that correct. Vulnerable narcissists use, it's their special crazy making weapon, use to abuse their targets. In order for you to understand the weapon, you need to understand a little bit of the structure of the personality that's coming with that weapon. So we say online, on YouTube, on the forums, we say covert, but actually in the relationship, it's fragile. Sometimes it will be described as vulnerable. So this was to express that it was in opposition to the previously defined narcissistic personality for the grandiose narcissist. And they'll say, wait, there is a type of narcissist who's fragile, who's vulnerable, who will show weakness, who's not the alpha male, the alpha female, top of their class. They'll actually be vulnerable, and actually promote feelings of vulnerability. Why is it important for you to understand their fragility in terms of the structure?
Mm.
Once upon a time, it really didn't matter whether a small group of people subscribed to some quite out there ideas. However, nowadays, most of
the idea.
New Sensodyne Sensitivity and Gum is a dual-action toothpaste with a low-abrasion formula. It builds a protective layer over sensitive areas and targets and removes
this day. Do you hear me, Lord? It is summer of the year 999. For 400 years, we people of England have prayed to Christ, who will forsake us all in our time of need. And lead us not into temptation, and deliver us from evil.
Anglo-Saxon England by the year 1000 was a very highly organised Christian country. It had a hierarchy, with the king at the top and different grades of people, thanes and free men, and the slaves knowing their places.
The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was our latest evidence of the events around the year 1000. That's a very pessimistic outlook.
This was a very prosperous country, but increasingly vulnerable at the time to organised attacks from the north, from the Vikings.
In 995 came a long-haired comet, token of evil. 998, a Viking host seized the island wide. 999, a Viking fleet assailed the Medway, burning and slaying in the Shire of Kent. Anglamond is alone small villages stretching from here in Kent to Northumbria. Our king, Ethelred, is far to the west in his capital, Winchester. I am Cuthbert, village priest of Mount Vernon. In this, my chronicle, I want to know the 40 God-fearing souls of my village, true folk of England. This village is our world. For 600 years, our forefathers were walking in this place. They came across the sea to settle this island when the Romans left. Samples and Saxons, they were heathens then. And now we've seen the light of Christ. Wolfridge, he a blacksmith's son, first to make easy oil, and lowering last night's armfuls of ale. Kindreds with claws around their hearts, walking by the chimney or the pole of the cock. The motto was in route too. Fleas and lice are our big mates under the thatched roofs. What's happening? Coonhill, she's still betrothed. She was wed soon. I would keep her from sin.
What's that?
The Pope really united the Jackson's his health, physical health, and so why is hard? Be hot, be healthy. Top of the morning routine. They want practical, healthy. I suppose that if you or I were tuning in to Anglo-Saxon chant this morning, it would sound rather harsh and gravelly, a bit like waves dashing in up on a single beach. Here, Shava Hada, hail to the Kena, more to the Mala, to the Maganipla. All the words come from our language that are good and short and tough for words and terse and hard and quick, come from Anglo-Saxon. Move, warm of the ground, earth, sea, ship, sky, love.
Everything like difficulties. It has a lot of physical work. The average Anglo-Saxon is much fitter than we are, though being much less likely to be overweight than people are now. That really wasn't the problem with the Anglo-Saxons. They were very rich when it gets a chance to get fat. We don't think people actually want to got much at all. It's a bit hard for somebody who works on the street to say that we actually do care with people who really spend.
Our village life is rooted in the land. We live alongside bulls, pigs, and poultry. We're hardy, not squeamish. We must rear and grow all we need. 100 years ago, King Alfred cast out the Viking raiders. But in my lifetime, in the reign of King Ethelred, the heathens from Daneland come back to Christian people. To work to their taxes to pay, so that the king's army could keep the unbelievers at bay.
By the year 1000, Anglo-Saxon society was very highly organised. There was a very developed hierarchy with the king at the top and the slaves at the bottom, and different grades of people in between.
Slaves, we call them thralls, are always drunk. They do heavy work with the pigs and the plough. Their chapel, left in rails, not so the cabin was all no land. We shelter them until they run away when they be stoned to death. That is our law. Slaves may not sit beside their lord. Frown. This is a slave's overseer and governor. His wife said it with child. We can't pay by name what he's going to count. These are our reeds, the veil, collected for our fame, and not the robbery, and but with the rich freeman, they churn, as we call it. His father left him over 60 acres in his room. Godwin grows barley in reeds and lakes, or rather the slaves grow barley in reeds and lakes for it. That's their place.
What man that was a slave in Anglo-Saxon society through a variety of pathways, and one of these could be as a captive in that skirmish or battle. You could also be born into slavery. You could also end up as a slave if, say, you had been convicted of a crime, you were unable to pay the fine that was required of you, then you would end up in penal slavery.
Our rich is our blacksmith, a less wealthy freeman. He makes tools and weapons.
and so he's given it 28 holding from our thing. Like his forefathers, Alfred passes on his craft to his son Wolfrich. But in war, there's no call for arrogance and shields than for the church across it. And we mustn't overlook the reflection ribbon altogether in the end of it. Their hands like the Lord's hands are never idle. Every moment they grind the word till it's all
Making French was Williamsburg. It was one of the hardest, most time-consuming things that they did. Basically because of grinding the flour. One of the reasons that they didn't make the form of bread was that grinding flour was such hard work and took such a long time. There's a big difference actually between Anglo-Saxon teeth and modern teeth, because of course their flour was stone ground and little bits of brick would come into the flour. So by the time people were eating bread, they were grinding their teeth down, and by the time somebody was, well, I suppose, in late middle age, they might actually have no enamel left on their top of their teeth at all, but it would be quite painful. The life in one of the wooden houses would have been cosy because they would have had a fire going all the time, which they can't. It would have been smoky. All the smoke would have gone up to the upper half. And we do know that quite a lot of them suffered from sinusitis, presumably contracted from sitting around in smoking environments. The train deposits obviously contain people's bodily waste, but also intestinal parasites, particularly worms. Tapeworm we have now, then we have whipworm, and there was one still called a scurry, which they had as well, which would be a footworm. Of course, they didn't have toilet paper. What they did use were leaves, moss, anything that was reasonably soft. Does that be a joke? What is the cleanest leaf? And the answer is holly, because of course we did find that seasonal holly. Do you know they comb their hair? Because we find their combs, lots of combs, quite elaborately made. Some of those combs had nits on them. Women, certainly married women, would wear a cloth over their head all the time and all outside. There was some kind of belief that women's attraction lay in their hair. Yeah, there's a pretty girl with nice thing on her hair. And yet once somebody was married, she wasn't supposed to be attractive to everybody else.
No veil yet for Brunhild. She's unwind. Her father Oswald is away fighting the Vikings. Her charms have been noted by Godwin's brother Edmund, a Welsh churl and a Gothic boy. Picked by his horse, they say. Brunhild's father is in our Thane's war band, part of the Fears, the Angler army, tracking down the Viking foe. Wolfrich has been chosen one day to take his place at our Thane's side. Great honour for a mere blacksmith's son. He could win booty, be granted his own land. All the better to win over some girl.
War, of course, provided the chooses of people, as well as causing many problems. So there was much more social mobility than there had been before. And someone who perhaps didn't have the chance to become a soldier and then possibly to improve his status might well find that a place was available for him in the fair because so many other men have died.
Brunhild has more than one strain sneaking around.
The main thing about childbirth was that it was extremely painful. That was the curse that you had to suffer with the children. And in the 1000, there was no effective pain relief. Life expectancy on average was very low. The worst time was the first 5 years of life, and within that, the time around birth. But childbirth was really a female thing. One woman in the village would probably come out. So there would be a whole load of women in the house, and the men probably wouldn't be in the thing.
It is lazy. Midsummer. Tomorrow, like Christmas Godwin's kin. I follow meekly in the footsteps of St. Augustine, who came from Rome 400 years ago to baptize us England. My flock are God-fearing, but theirs is a life of toil. As priest, I seek truly to unfold the Gospels to them.
In the year 1000, there was still going on a revival in the church, which had begun in the reign of Ethelred's father, Edgar, and it was beginning to have an effect on village communities. Ordinary people would now be expected to go to church perhaps more frequently than they had done before, but the great hope of the reformers was that the parish priest would explain to people what Christianity was about, the meaning of the services was, and how they could infuse it into their everyday lives.
Don't make the blood wearier hero. See his leaf, blood, and flame.
Baptism around the year 1000 was very similar to a baptism service today. The role of the godparents was important. The role of the family was very important as well. It was in fact the defining moment in becoming a Christian. You needed to be baptised to be a Christian.
Settlement, Krugild's father, has been gravely wounded. Our Lord Thane Edmund has ridden over 30 miles to bring him back from the final battle.
Thing for a woman would be a salve, I suppose, to cover it up and to soothe it. And those would be usually made of fat with some herbs in them. But it was also understood that it was important to keep wounds clean, so they would be cleaned with things like honey. And of course, even if a wound had apparently healed up, something could still be coming on. They could get what we now understand as blood poisoning, so they'd be feverish and they'd be debilitated and they could even die in the end.
It's hard to see lost one with no grey hairs. I shall pray for such a worthy man. I pray you live perhaps for the sake of his daughter. Not good yet. Lord, keep us from the Vikings. Bring death to our door. I have a sad tale to set down. Which is the year 999, last summer before 1000. While King Ethelred covers in land, Vikings were Viking. Our warrior Oswald has fallen from the heathen swords and lies dying. His daughter, Gudrun, can't watch his fairy off.
In the year 1000, the king was King Ethelred II, who has the nickname the Unready. That's the play on his name. Ethelred Noble Council, Unred New Council, or possibly Ill Council. And it's thought that he got his name from being badly prized by some of the nobles around him. Soon after Ethelred had come to the throne in 978, Viking raids began again, and so by 1000 there must have been a lot of fear and insecurity in many parts of the country.
How many more warriors broken bones will lie on this hill before the Vikings are done? Who guards us at this evil time? We paid twice over, once with the lives of our sons, and again with our hard-earned silver.
The tax was raised not only by the king in order to swell his own coffers, but by around the year 1000, enormous payments of silver were being made to the Vikings. For example, we find more Anglo-Saxon coins in the Viking payments than we do in England.
The thieving heathens will not take these, I pray. And someday, but Oswald's son will not go missing the work of Christ.
The priest was responsible for burying the dead, and this often led to great disputes over where a particular person should be buried, because a payment had to be made to the priest upon burial, and we know that priests often fought over corpses in a rather unceremonious manner in order to acquire not just the clothes, but more importantly, the burial fee.
Work stops for all now, even the dead. Summer comes to an end, let us ready ourselves for cold months. Life was on, even for dark and heavy.
Anglo-Saxon England was rich, and that depended largely on sheep. The sheep is really the ideal multi-purpose animal. It's got fleece, which people use to make clothes, to keep you warm. It gives you meat. It gives you tallow, which you can use to make candles, and you can milk it as well.
The silver penny goes right back to Anglo-Saxon England, and it was a coinage that was very much centralised. It was withdrawn every 6 years to be reminted.
Toward Weaver.
Costs for the minting of the salts coins, and if the money was caught minting coins in the woods, as it was then he could expect to have his hand chopped off and fastened above the doorway of his mill. It was a clear indication then that the person had arrived.
Not talk of coins today. My villagers must forget worldly sins, for it is Sunday. day at rest for most, but a day of work for me as I watch all of my wayward flock.
Priests were responsible for the pastoral care of villages at this time, and they were responsible for making sure that the villagers adhered to the villagers' feasts. They were responsible for making sure that the villagers went to church on a Sunday. And the law was very clear that villagers mustn't do any work at all on Sunday, or else they'd be fined, and they'd have to carry anything anywhere. And the priest was responsible for ensuring that that happened. So that might sometimes mean that the priest wasn't particularly popular.
Fishing. I should find you.
What was considered a luxury, it was something that nuns and monks gave up going into the monastery for practical stuff. That's an affectation. It was something that was nice, but that wasn't necessary. And the ordinary Anglo-Saxon peasants certainly never saw a bath and probably didn't wash very much at all either.
What she do? Bathing. Bathing can only lead to sin. Leave oppositely up in my own garden. Do not eat your fridge.
The church has never had a very good opinion of any form of sex. Lawful marriage is the least of evils. It's not particularly good in itself, but all other forms of sex are constantly fulminated against. Fornication, incest, rape, sleeping with nuns, you name it, some priest has complained about it. When it came to marriage, this wasn't an entirely personal choice. Marriages were contracted between families, and women wouldn't have a lot of choice about who they were able to marry. Although the law is clear that women weren't forced to marry someone that they didn't wish to marry.
Could never have made a choice, but I fear everyone does not give them.
What is the act now? The smithest man of land root. Ye couldn't do for weaver, where you from the Athora land. No, hey, I got footballing sonner.
All of the adult male villages belonged to a tithing, which was almost like a local neighbourhood watch group, which was responsible for making sure that everybody adhered to the law. And that was really the point of contact between the law, which was being created by the king and by his advisors, and local people.
Beyond the tithing, the village worked together to defend our kingdom, from making our pets to giving up a sword to the few, the army. Our settlement gives sacrifice for the greater good. This may be the last time the blacksmith's two sons play together. It is time for Wolfridge to go and fight on. He may be put down in battle, but of course the price for him away would be shame and an awful death. I pray he will be more than just arrogant. Wolfridge leaves our village to face the forbs. To Warwickshire, our people within strongholds are buried areas where armies mustered. The war-bound heads to Hastings off their encampment.
In the year 1000, the king, Ethelred, was very weak in his factory king. There was some trifling thoughts when the army was supposed to be going out, he was coming in. When the enemy were in the west, then the army must have been east.
Viking raiders are near. Only God knows which is fate now.
The Anglo-Saxon sense of fate was that the shape of our life, the time we were born, the main events in our life, the time we die, was already determined. But I think that the shapers, the gods, have nothing to say in shaping the colour of our lives. The way in which if we have a sense of humour, it can be a lot more better, even if we're suffering.
Königs selber, Quän, Spielung, Hit, Locken, Hom.
Any event in the Anglo-Saxon period would lend itself to verse, which is how most people would have heard the news. The poet remained a key member of society, articulating the stories that told the English about themselves and about their origins, a medium by which, in other words, they identified themselves as English.
What? Med garderna, gärda från fältkunningar frun.
Which loosely translated, quite what was the same word, drawing attention to the declamation that would be hushed when the great word what went out. How we have heard of the erstwhile fame of the spear-wielding folk kings of the days of yore.
Of Schildtjärven, Tjärvenafälten, Nonnefallet.
Beowulf is the great epic that forms the beginning of literary art in the English language.
Well, so the book.
I wish my congregation was as rapt as this was Sunday. They're always enthralled by the old tale handing down word of mouth of that monster killer Beowulf and those ale-rowdying warriors in their hall. They have a great feast, and there's of course singing in the feast. And it is the sound of the singing that introduces us to the next major character in the poem, namely the monster Grendel.
Beowulf was a villain.
We hear the tale again, and you can't stand the sound of the singing. Grendel, perhaps the most frightening monster in all English literature. It is quite possible to trace back the monster in the film Alien or the monster in the film Predator to Grendel as their prototype.
Now it's a draft. Såna för att de funde fjärna här.
And Grendel is immune to edged weapons of any kind, which Beowulf is aware of, so he proposes to grapple him in a great wrestling match. Grendel is surprised that one of his victims actually fights back. And what's more, gets him into a very strong wrestling hold that appears to be a kind of half Nelson. And eventually, he does manage to wriggle and twist himself free, but at the cost of his own arm, which Beowulf is left hanging on to in the same grip.
Jag når det med faktum. Jag får fram.
The Beowulf is enormously significant because it's been deeply into a most profound comment on human life. Someone who is a real thinker and who says, what on earth is our life about here on earth? How are we to make sense of it? And what are the consequences of the words live by?
Each seven son.
And by now everyone's getting a bit fed up and getting a bit more rowdy and a bit more stupid with their lead. And I say, go on, tell us a riddle. And maybe he starts asking a riddle. He said, well, I've had enough of this. Why don't you tell me a riddle? Because the riddles are the song of the unsung labourer. They're the songs of the illiterate.
No, for Edmund, riddles of others.
There are some riddles which are very saucy which purport to describe objects around the kitchen and around the household, but actually describe parts of the female and male anatomy.
Stephanie Ismail. Personne için better. Nathan Rufnatwa. Seo Demechnewa. We've wondered what's with that air.
Humanity is fearful from the French. Our faces true monsters that are fiercely red. It is harvest month, fall in the year of our Lord, 999. Since we were overcome with the Battle of Morden 8 years ago, our people have feared the Viking men who raid our kingdom. My fellow churchmen whisper that the Vikings are the Antichrist who will bring the world to an end. And out into this darkness beyond our village has gone the French, our blacksmiths, saying to it, fighting the Vikings.
The prototype Viking raids around the year 1000 was to raise money, so they were partly looking to take booty, but like many other early medieval peoples, they were relying upon taking tribute, by which they meant they were relying upon people paying them money to go away. So they tended to ravage an area, literally burning places down, doing cattle and even people, until they made such a nuisance of themselves that somebody would organise a tribute to take them away. As the rates got on, people would find it increasingly difficult to pay that money, and churches were having to sell their silver, men were having to sell their land, and if you didn't have any land to sell, you might even sell yourself and members of your family into slavery. The Viking attacks were seen as evidence for the wars which in the Book of Revelations are mentioned as the type of thing that we'll see in the reign of Antichrist, and after that, that'll be the end of the world.
The church was very pessimistic about the Viking raids. Many churchmen thought that the Viking raiders were some sort of divine punishment from God because they hadn't been adhering to their prayers and hadn't been going to church enough.
Undoubtedly, certain sections of the ecclesiastical establishment believed that the world would end 1,000 years after the birth of Christ or the death of Christ. Archbishop Wulfstan has left us a very impressive sermon addressing the English as Leover men, beloved men. Ye can know what that self is, know what the truth is. This world is on Ulster, this world is in haste, and yet there lacketh done ender, and it rushes to its end. This is one of the most explicit references to the fact, the belief that the world would end in some form or other around about the turn of the first millennium.
Battle of Morden was the first time that the Anglo-Saxons suffered a serious defeat in this round of the new Viking attacks. One of the oldest and most respected yeomen, Bertmas, was killed, and I think this was a warning signal to the Anglo-Saxons that they could be in trouble.
Stop, get out! Get out, Mullen! Not ready! The lines in which the Emperor of the English, whose name is Bertha, speaks to the Danish herald who's asking him for Danegeld rather than fighting a battle, could be applicable to any invader. I can imagine it being said to Napoleon, or Hitler, or even some of the bureaucrats in Brussels. When Woodruff said, "You hear the storm saileth, what this folk saith." Translated, "Do you hear, sailor, what this folk says? We'll give you spears as tribute and time-tested swords."
What were the Vikings like? They were out-eager. There's a terrific word in battle. It describes a ship which was icy and eager to sail. That's how I think of the Vikings. They were trusting, confident, opportunistic, and enormously successful. They were also arrogant, ill, lacking in compassion. It doesn't sound to be a horrific place to be. The only thing that kept them together was the fact that they knew men around them. The archaeological evidence tends to come from skeletons that shows particularly that sword blades can be quite devastating, cleaving skulls, amputating limbs.
Winter comes, and time will live to see it. Some pigs we cannot feed all through the cold months. The time is good for them to eat.
One of the months in autumn was called Blackmas, which means black months. They always wanted more meat because it was protein and fat that were least abundant in their diet.
The Anglo-Saxons had far less variety of foodstuff than we do, and not all species that we think of as being native species existed then. They didn't have any potatoes, they didn't have any tomatoes.
Leeks, they're very keen on leeks. That was their favourite vegetable. They also got carrot stuff. But they weren't very bothered about vegetables. What they really liked was meat.
They ought to be looking for gaps in the line, and then really concentrating on it so that you can try and get a clear shot. If you know that the arrow is coming with a shield, it's relatively easy to defend yourself. The archer will be moving around as much as possible, trying to catch people who are concentrating.
Anglo-Saxon beer would look cloudy. It's made basically the same way as it is now, out of malted barley. People did drink a lot more beer than you would expect because the water wasn't necessarily very clean. They might have a nice well, but they might not. They might have to get their water from the river, and that would be the same river that they were throwing all their rubbish into, so they wouldn't be drinking to drink it.
A happy day. Our Lord famed Edwin and the Flitch will come back. This time they thought of the Viking swords. They're safe till spring at least, when the Vikings will come again. Northridge has been looking with more spoils. We should note that down and make some good fortune.
Well, it's unfair, planned.
I do think the Anglo-Saxons had a good time, but they were certainly capable of having a good time as much as we are today. The idea of a great feasting hall presided over by a benign leader was very much their idea of heaven on earth, and for many of them, their idea of heaven itself. Fighting all day and drinking all night. So what more could you want?
The Anglo-Saxons are underrated. There's this extraordinary idea that before the Roman conquest, there was a miserable dark age of savage peasants who had no idea how to organise life. Whereas in fact, Anglo-Saxon England is the starting point for much that we think of as valuable and significant about later medieval and modern England.
Our language, our place names, our churches, many systems of government all go back to the Anglo-Saxon period. It's not true to say that the history of the country begins with 1066. That's a mere blip on the history of the people of England.
It is you. Dawn is near. On the first day of the 1000th year since the birth of our Lord. All seems well. Our future eyes will mark our future good health and the children thou bear. The world is not come to an end. How much we shall both stand as wrong then? Life goes on. Will our people still be here in another 1000 years?
Some characteristics of the English today and of the Anglo-Saxons would seem uncommonly like what we have now as the year 2000 dawns is something stoical, kind of back to the wall of toughness. There's a melancholy, there's some fatalism, and I think there's a great love of ceremony, of doing things the right way, of ritual. In some, I think we'd be fools not to look back, to look forward.
Pizza Pops ads for moms.
Pizza Pops? I thought they'd be a quick daddy snack you can make yourself.
Mom, I really appreciate everything you do for this family.
Hey, let's get matching haircuts. Yes.
Pizza Pops, we're good.
43 AD, a great army descended upon the shores of Britain. The strongest ever yet seen in this part of the globe. Tens of thousands of highly organized fighting men from all corners of the known world, come to put an end to the independence of this obscure island once and for all. Of course, the landing was not unopposed. Contemporary writing talks of rows of determined Celtic warriors lining the white cliffs overlooking the landing craft, hurling challenges and insults at their seaborne foe. Though distant, perched on the very edge of the world, in fact, the islands didn't exist in a vacuum, and murmurings of this great mustering across the channel had arrived long before their sails were sighted off British shores, giving the Britons time enough to amass a great army of their own to meet the invaders head on. However, the enemy they were about to face was unlike any they'd encountered before. This was the Imperial Roman army. Their countrymen had been here before, nearly a century earlier, and other aborted invasion attempts followed. But this invasion, led by the Emperor Claudius, was very real. The Romans were now here to stay. As column after column of well-disciplined professional soldiers landed on the shores of this obscure, remote land, little did either side know that their clash would force this region into the wider world, bringing it definitively out of the Iron Age and into a literate, city-dwelling society, beginning one of the most famous epochs in all of its history. This is the entire history of Roman Britain, an epic story spanning more than 500 years, the reverberations and still visible remnants of which can still be seen today, more than 1,500 years later. Hello and welcome to History Time. As always, I'm your host, Pete Kelly. This video was written and researched by Eric Tenwald. He runs a great Instagram page called Roman Military History. Go check it out here for all things Rome. Shortly, we'll return to the Roman world, but first, a quick word from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by a long-time supporter of the channel, and one of my favourite streaming services on the web, Magellan TV. For just a small monthly fee, you can find thousands of documentaries on any subject you can think of. History, geography, science, culture, and much, much more. All streamed directly to your phone, your tablet, and your smart TV. My current recommendation, and one that I think all you Rome fans out there will love, is the fascinating hidden history of Rome. And there's lots of shows on other aspects of ancient Rome and ancient history too. Now I've teamed up with Magellan TV to offer you an exclusive free trial. Head on over to try.magellantv.com/historytime or click on my link in the description below. Now, back to the ancient world. Today, the history of the Roman invasion and occupation of Britain is relatively well known. A vast plethora of written sources and archaeological evidence offering up an incredible array of information. Archaeological sites, written histories, inscriptions, letters even. But what can be said of the island before? A prehistoric world of of warrior chieftains and woodland spirits. The land of cattle rustling war bands. Colossal hill forts ruled over by landed aristocrats. Intricate metalwork, bardic storytelling. But, unfortunately for us, no literary tradition to speak of. As such, very little can be definitively said of British society in prehistoric times. Not even the languages they spoke. We can, however, say a few things for certain. From around the end of the second millennium BC, through a series of migrations from mainland Europe, Britain was drawn into the orbit of the Celtic world, bringing with them the latest cultural and military developments. Today, we categorise these continent-spanning archaeological cultures as the Hallstatt and La Tène, named for the earliest sites associated with them. By the time the Romans first arrived in Britain in the mid-1st century BC, the La Tène culture had largely overlaid previous ones. This is not to say that any sort of shared identity existed amongst the various peoples of Europe, divided as they were into a multitude of nations and tribes. Despite their shared Celtic ancestry and probable shared religion, the Britons were by no means a unified people. Rather, they were divided into several tribal kingdoms, dispersed across various regions, dominated by warrior aristocracies, usually each one led by a ruling monarch or family of monarchs. By the time of the Emperor Claudius's invasion in 43 AD, the southern, continent-facing tribes had a long history of trade contacts with mainland Europe, especially in Gaul, recently conquered by Rome. British society was an agricultural one, its people mostly residing in villages made up of the Iron Age roundhouses typical of this part of the world. However, much larger settlements and hill forts existed too. Proto-cities known as oppida in Latin, scattered all across the island. Like their cousins elsewhere in the ancient world, the British Celts were talented artists and metalworkers, also having a fairly sophisticated industry. The southern tribes notably minting their own coins prior to the invasion. Like the Romans, British religion was polytheistic. Today, we know the names of more than 200 of their gods. Though this may well reflect regional variants or names given to the same god or goddess in different regions, something that the Romans and Greeks also practiced. And of course, Britain was particularly significant for Celtic religion. For according to the Romans, this was the birthplace of the Druids. A senior priestly class whose practices are known to have included the sacrifice of humans. A religion which so horrified the usually religiously tolerant Romans that it would be outlawed on pain of death. Archaeology suggests British society to have been highly martial in nature. A landscape coated in hill forts, battles waged by chariot-riding aristocrats, leading warrior bands to war. Though their main strength was in their infantry, mostly unarmoured and armed mainly with spears, swords, and shields, sometimes charging into battle entirely naked to demonstrate their valour. The Britons also made use of good quality cavalrymen. The usage of war chariots was also widespread, not just as a symbol of power, but for actual battle, a relic of the past in much of the rest of the world by the time Rome reached these shores. These expensive pieces of equipment were a special reserve of a tribe's aristocracy, the only people who could realistically afford to maintain them. Though chariots had long since fallen into disuse elsewhere, in ancient Britain and Ireland, the tribes continued to field large numbers of them for several more centuries. It's even been theorised that many of the British hill forts were only occupied in wartime, utilised as springboards for chariot operations. Soon enough, however, this Iron Age world would crash modernity. Prior to their first great expedition to the island, the Roman world seems to have had very little knowledge of Britain, a realm of myth and legend. Yet, for many historians, the first Roman expeditions here, in fact, amounted to little more than one individual's quest for glory and fame. When Gaius Julius Caesar, a consul of Rome, arrived off the British coast in 55 BC, he entered a land of intertribal warfare, complex dynastic allegiances, and massive pitched battles. But this, of course, he was an expert at. Caesar was a member of the old patrician family of the Julii Caesares, who proudly claimed descent from the goddess Venus, but had never been especially distinguished in Roman politics. Caesar, however, attracted widespread attention starting from the dictatorship of Sulla, going on to enjoy a successful career in politics and a decent track record in the army. In 58 BC, he was able to attain a major command and began campaigning in Gaul, bringing more and more of the region under Roman control in a series of stunning victories before turning his gaze to Britain. As a pretext for his invasion, Caesar claimed that the Britons represented a military danger to Roman interests, and even that they had supported the Gauls during his war against them. In societies like Celtic Britain, it was indeed normal for individual warriors to seek employment elsewhere, heading out to neighbouring tribes to seek glory and pay in the warrior retinues of lords. And the discovery of Gallo-Belgic coins in Britain does suggest that British mercenaries were indeed hired during Caesar's campaigns to fight against him by the Gauls. But even with this factor, the claim of a British threat was ultimately a convenient pretext, and there were other, more personal reasons that drew Caesar to the remote island. For rumours also existed of Britain being an extremely wealthy land, which offered the prospect of another lucrative campaign. Caesar was particularly convinced, falsely as it turned out, that Britain was a source of especially high-quality pearls. However, we do know that Britain was an especially significant source of tin in ancient times, as well as other precious metals. In addition, there was a special kind of glory to be gained as the first Roman to lead an army into unexplored territory. The Romans knew very little of Britain, leading to wild rumours of savage tribesmen, strange customs, monsters, and demons. And
being able to attain mastery over this untamed corner of the world was especially tempting for a man like Caesar. Caesar had been distracted by affairs in Gaul for some time, mopping up resistance and dividing up the spoils of his conquests. So his planned British expedition began late in the summer. As such, it could have been little more than a reconnaissance in force or a raid, as he expected to be able to return to Gaul for the winter. For better or for worse, Caesar embarked his now veteran 7th and 10th legions, along with a force of cavalry, and prepared to launch his attack. However, he had underestimated the unpredictability and strength of the local tides, especially in the English Channel. Due to the weather, the cavalry transports were unable to follow up the initial invasion. The landing of the legions was rapid and chaotic, as Britannic warriors immediately attacked them with beaches, continually running forth from the tree line to hurl challenges and javelins at the approaching foreign foe. As Caesar's soldiers determinedly continued to set up their former command base. The fighting was bitter, but eventually the Romans were able to force a landing and hold a beachhead. Caesar's prowess in battle was also enough to overawe the local tribes into submission. However, the Britons soon decided to renew the war, after more Roman transports arriving from Gaul were swept aside or damaged in a storm, continuing to throw soldiers onto the stranded Roman army. This wasn't the first time Caesar had been hopelessly outnumbered and surrounded by foes, and once again he was able to defeat the Britons, finally forcing them into a pitched battle where the superior training, discipline, and equipment of the Roman army soon prevailed. With this victory, Caesar brought his campaign to a close, returning to Gaul after making peace with many of the British leaders. However, the campaign had been closely fought and very nearly turned into a total disaster. Not the overwhelming victory Caesar had hoped for. Taking no chances, next year he returned to battle with a far stronger army, this time consisting of 5 legions, again including the 7th and the 10th, supported by auxiliary cavalrymen from Gaul, and his friend and client king, Commius, who interestingly was able to raise further pro-Roman troops from inside Britain. Travelled on a colossal fleet of 28 warships and 600 troop transports. The landing was once again problematic due to the Mediterranean Romans underestimating the strength of the tides of the North Sea. But eventually, Caesar was able to disembark his whole force and anchor his fleet in good order. He then led a large part of the army and defeated a coalition of tribes that tried to oppose him, probably due to style. However, the storms once again caused damage to the Roman fleet, forcing Caesar to halt his advance and urgently begin repairs, which gave the Britons time to recover. This time, they were also united by a charismatic war leader named Cassivellaunus, who made use of the Britons' numerous cavalry and chariots to harass and ambush several Roman foraging parties, picking them off one by one using strategy of guerrilla warfare. Yet, once again, Caesar was able to turn the tables on the Britons by supporting an exiled nobleman from the Trinobantes in regaining East Rome, whose father had been murdered by Cassivellaunus. This policy of divide and rule, utilised so effectively in Gaul, soon encouraged others to switch sides to the Romans. and Caesar soon delivered a crushing blow to Cassius Valerius' prestige by taking his personal stronghold, ultimately causing British resistance to falter. The war was over for now. When Caesar left Britain, he was able to establish a client relationship with many of the defeated tribes of the south. But his campaigns proved to be a huge propaganda success in Rome. However, in practical terms, the invasion had achieved little. And it's likely that the annual tribute promised by the Britons was soon halted. In a curious byproduct of the invasion, Caesar's Belgic cavalry commander, Commius, king of the Atrebates, soon seized his chance to rise up against Roman rule, alongside a number of other client kings. Ultimately failing to overthrow the invaders, but making his escape to Britain to establish a new dynasty on the island and live out the rest of his days there. His Atrebates tribe would add to an ever-changing patchwork of peoples, now probably enjoying more contacts with the continent than ever before. Though it would be nearly a century before the Romans returned to Britain in force.
Testing sewage for traces of disease is yet another concept new to most of us, delivered by the pandemic. Justin Chandler Pell. Testing sewage for traces of disease is yet another concept new to most of us, delivered by the pandemic. Justin Chandler covers the Hamilton Niagara region for Ontario Mountains, and he's been looking into how it's being used for rodents. Hey, Justin. Hey there. All right, so last time you were here on the program, we talked about sort of the challenges of tracking Omicron and some of the different tools public health officials can use to get a sense of COVID outside of regular PCR tests. This time we're talking about using wastewater, which I'm sure a lot of people have had, and I'm curious to talk about that a little bit more. But I want to know, this method of detecting disease has been around for a while. How has it been used in the past? Yeah, for at least 60 years, scientists have been testing wastewater. It started with polio, but they've also tested for things like drug use. So just trying to check generally the concentration of the substance in a environment, basically. And when we talk about Omicron, of course, cases are harder to count now. How is wastewater being used to monitor the disease? So similar to how it was used with polio, basically Omicron sheds in some species. So as long as you're pooping into a wastewater system, and scientists can get access into that system, there's the ability then to measure the concentration of Omicron or any COVID-19. The Omicron is something they are able to drill down and measure specifically. And they can try to see on a population level how much there is. So in a certain area, they won't be able to say there's this many cases, but they'll be able to say there's this much COVID, and yesterday there was more or less or about the same, and they can try to trend that. Now, there have been some reports that wastewater Omicron has peaked in some areas of Ontario. Can you give us a snapshot of what wastewater is telling us in the province? Yes, so this is part of where it gets quite useful now, and advocates say that wastewater can be a really good tool right now because it's independent from testing. So as you mentioned, we talked before on the show about different challenges that we've had where people aren't able to get tested right now, so case counts aren't necessarily the most accurate way to track this. But people are continuing to poop in the sewer system, so we can keep tracking to see how much Omicron there is, how much COVID there is, and wastewater levels right now are showing that it seems like in a lot of communities, officials say that it's starting to either peak or go down at this point. So hopefully we're past the peak of the wave. I am curious in terms of collecting this data. I know we don't need to get into the nitty-gritty of the details, but where exactly are scientists testing the wastewater? This is not just one location. I imagine there's numerous locations. Yes, every public health unit in Ontario actually does this testing, and something like 80% of our population is able to be captured in wastewater testing. Different public health units work with different university labs for the most part, and they test in all different locations. So, for example, in Hamilton, there's 3 different locations that are tested, and so it really depends sort of where officials are trying to look at how much of the population they're trying to get. You can do population level testing where you're trying to get hundreds of thousands of people in your sample, or you could be doing something more specific, maybe where you're drilling down on an institution where vulnerable people live, like a homeless shelter or a long-term care. All right, so let's talk about sort of some of the issues that come with wastewater. It isn't necessarily the perfect way of testing. What are the ways that wastewater monitoring doesn't necessarily reap results? Well, I guess one of the biggest things to learn about it is, sort of like I mentioned earlier, you're getting a count on a level of COVID-19 in the population. So you're not able to say this many people are sick. You're able to say more people are getting sick or less people are getting sick. So it's good for tracking trends, but it's harder to get that specific number. When you want to do that sort of drilling down on a specific location, like I mentioned, like say a prison long-term care system, that requires you to be able to access piping in certain ways that might be more difficult depending on the infrastructure. There's also the challenge of determining when there's extra water in a system, how much of that is coming from people and how much of that is coming from, say, the snow or storm runoff. There are formulas that scientists use, like this process called normalization, that they use to try to account for that. So these are problems that people are working through. As you mentioned, all public health units are taking part in it, but some jurisdictions are going to publish their findings, where some, like Hamilton, don't. What's the discrepancy there and why? This is an interesting case, and it's kind of difficult to answer here because it's not something that public health in Hamilton has been the most forthcoming about. So both Ottawa and Hamilton use the same lab for testing, a team with the University of Ottawa. And Ottawa has been held up as an example of a place that really uses its wastewater testing, and Hamilton does not publicly report it, and public health says that they don't really look at it. And they say that it's not accurate to local trends. One of the researchers that I spoke to for my piece, Robert Delatola, he disagrees. He also tests with Ottawa, and he says that Hamilton's results are just as good. He says Ottawa's wastewater testing results really predict hospitalizations very well, and then Hamilton's do the same. Hamilton Public Health says this isn't the case, and they haven't really been able to tell me why that is. They just keep pointing back to the researchers and saying that's for them to figure out. So it's unfortunately something where we as the public are left kind of wondering what exactly is going on there. I am curious, why is it that we're in the 4th wave, and that, we're hearing about this sort of methodology now? I imagine this is something that's been being used since the 1st wave, but as we know, sometimes more data can be useful, sometimes it can be harmful. But do you have an idea as to why this data is being released sort of in this wave? Yeah, you're right. It's something that actually has been reported on before. I wrote about this back early when the pandemic was just, well, it didn't really start, but in the summer. After the pandemic started back in 2020, I was reporting on early initiatives to do this. But really, since then, this Folsom network has been set up, and there's a lot of work going on around the province. So it's something that's been going on for quite a while. I think just now there's a lot more stock put in it because as testing has declined, people have said, okay, where else can we look? And that answer for some is the sewers. Let's build on that. I'm curious, how could this technology evolve to monitor diseases in the future once we get past this one? Right, that researcher I mentioned, Robert Delatola, he told me he thinks that this infrastructure that we have with all these different labs connected to public health and working with one another throughout the province, that's something that we can really leverage going forward. And maybe we can be checking for influenza, maybe we can continue checking for substance use. Maybe there's
a different illness or ailment that will show up in human excrement that we can start testing for. And really, he says wastewater has shown to be an economic way of testing a lot of people. It doesn't rely on people specifically going in for testing. And so that there's just the potential that if this infrastructure stays alive, funding stays there, and we're working on it, with new health solutions in the future. We look at chronic disease. It's very interesting stuff, really great stuff. Thank you, Justin. Welcome, take care.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Art Detectives begins Wednesday at 9 on TVO. The Agenda with Steve Pagan is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tens of thousands of Ontarians have contracted the Omicron variant during this wave. Does that mean the pandemic is over for them? We'll find out. Then our Ontario Health report on how testing sewage helps track COVID-19. Also, a behind-the-scenes look at the brand new project, TVO Arts. And from housing affordability in rural Ontario to tensions over Ukraine, we've got the agendas we can review. It's Friday, January 28th, and that's ahead on the agenda. As soon as the Omicron wave landed, it seemed like everyone suddenly knew someone who had been sick with COVID. Often lots of people who have been very careful. As those numbers hopefully trend down, what do those who've recovered need to know about their immunity going forward? Let's ask both in the provincial capital. Colin Furness, infection control epidemiologist and assistant professor at the University of Toronto, and Susie Hoda, medical director of infection prevention and control and an infectious diseases specialist at the University Health Network. Welcome to you both.
Thanks.
So I'm one of those people who's dodged, I keep seeing memes on social media of people who've dodged COVID over the past 2 years. And this is not to make light of it, but it seems as if now everyone knows somebody who's had COVID. And I wanted to start our discussion by reading some quotes of people who have had Omicron and recovered. This is what some of them have said. It's just a load off their mind. Even other people who haven't had it, I find, are more receptive to hanging out because they're not worried that I will spread it. I am so relieved. I don't have the luxury of working from home. Being slightly sick for a few days was a small price to pay for being able to go to work without feeling paranoid. And one person said it was a part of her that was happy that I, quote, got it. Colin, I'd like to start with you. If you have Omicron and recovered, how should you be feeling right now?
I can certainly understand why people would be expressing relief, partly because in these cases they were fortunate to have had only a mild case. They didn't land up in hospital. They didn't land up with what sounds like long COVID. And so I think that would be quite relieving. In terms of their confidence about their immunity, I think the picture is less clear. COVID has been very good at evading our defenses. It's been very good at evolving. And it's entirely possible that people could be reinfected. We don't know yet. Omicron is still too new.
What about the sentiment? Earlier this week, Dr. Kieran Moore said, we have to learn how to live with COVID. If someone hears that, how do you think they're going to receive that message?
I think it depends on their stance. If you have parents and children under 5 who cannot be vaccinated, and you are acutely aware of the rising hospitalization rates in that very young age, it's just I've had many conversations with people in exactly that situation. Others have also been doing enough reading to know that this is a brain-invasive virus and loss of brain tissue is a possibility. So there's a lot to be worried about. And when our chief medical officer of health says, let's just learn to live with it, I think that's upsetting to a great number of people. It's pretty dispiriting to me.
And Susie, one of the people that I quoted said that their friends would be more comfortable hanging out with them since they've had Omicron. Should they be?
It's a really difficult thing to kind of, wrap your head around. First of all, in the short term, after you've had an Omicron infection, yes, you're probably immune, and yes, the chances that you would, get sick from it again in that, say, 3 months or so after your infection is quite low. However, can you still pick up some of the virus and transmit to others? We don't really know. As Colin had mentioned, there's so much we still don't really know about the immunity after an Omicron infection. But I think a lot of these comments too are really just speaking to the enormous mental burden that this has taken, on people, having to think about, will I get infected? Won't I? What will it be like when I get an infection, or if I get an infection? And that's where a lot of these comments are coming from, where people feel so relieved. But we have to be careful not to extrapolate too far from that.
And Colin, just to build on what Susie was saying, we don't know very much. A lot of the data I think we're dealing with was the previous strains of COVID-19. When you hear people, I think for some people, when they hear mild, they're not relieved, as you said, if you have children under 5, if you're living with a disability, or if you're immunocompromised. How would you characterize the level of protection that Omicron gives people?
As Susie said, we're just not sure. I mean, the evidence is mixed prior to Omicron in terms of whether natural immunity is better or worse than vaccinated immunity. Of course, there's multiple vaccines. There's probably genetic factors at play. I think there's going to be a wide range of individual responses. And so I think it's worrisome, it's problematic to make blanket statements about safety with respect to immunity following infection. This is, for many people, an extremely dangerous virus, and we know in many instances when people have been reinfected, that still doesn't tell us very much, except that we shouldn't be complacent. I think that would be the one big mistake to make, would be to be complacent.
And Susie, this is a question for you both, but also Susie, I'll start with you. Pre-Omicron studies have compared the level of immunity from a COVID infection to a single dose of vaccination, others a double dose. And we've been hearing from people say, I've had COVID, so I don't need to be vaccinated. How should we understand the level of immunity we get from vaccines versus infection? Susie, let's start with you.
Well, first of all, we deal with different variants over the course of this pandemic, so it's hard to draw conclusions from data from one study. But the other part of it is
There are about 30 different nations looking at the Algonquin Islands. All these nations occupy the Appalachian region, making it shore. There is about 1 million of people compared to the northeastern United States. The Hawaiian nations have settled in the eastern Pacific regions and in the South Lawrence Island. This group includes several nations like the Yuan, Iroquois, Oshkosh, and Stadaconians. The Vikings were the first Europeans to arrive in Canada. After settling in 1988, they arrived around the year 1000 and built a second settlement, the House of Millers, at the northernmost tip of the Empire. The Italian explorer Gian Cabot was son Sebastian Cabot, on the later spires under King Henry II working in the southeast for America and the provinces of China. Portuguese explorer Diogo Fernandes Gallardo followed the current modern-day Gaspar Octavian were as well visiting Newfoundland in the 15th century. Portugal were capturing indigenous groups. The Portuguese abandoned the idea of colonizing the land because of frequently the efforts in South America. There were also complaints of Europeans using Labrador and Newfoundland fish whales and trout. The Basques, established after the 9th coast, later several European fisheries began to fish as well. English and French crowns even sent expeditions to North America to look for popular Indians. There were also marked fishing areas in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It is the French who were installed permanent ports and found canals. Jacques Cartier, French explorer, who went across the Gaspé under the name of Jesuits. In 1534, the territory that would later be known as New France would bear the name Canada. The origin of the name comes from the word Canada, meaning village in Uruguay. Its roots refer to Stadaconas, which is today the center of Quebec City. Nearly 50 years later, some Quebecers, an English explorer, named Saint John of France in 1582, where Louis Morgan, with Queen Elizabeth I, who becomes a pioneer of English colonization to North America. However, the living plants did not be secured because of his death. It was in 1604 that the beginning of European colonization was taking place, to the founding of Port Royal, the capital of Imperial. In 1608, the city of Quebec would be founded by Samuel de Champlain, who had purchased with the indigenous people of the region. At the time, the French had a good relationship with them. Quebec City would become the capital of France. Between 1608 and 1662, it was a fur trade with the 1721, King George I granted a charge for the foundation of the National College to Sir William Alexander for the creation of the However, before the creation of the college, the 16th, the English navigate and the access discovered to which the British during the realm of exploration and find the methods besides which Montreal would be founded as the domain of Greenland. In 1632, the evangelized from Virginia, their chiefest Catholic missionaries would be brought into the colony. In 1662, Louis XIV, the new king of France, charged Jean Talon to populate the colony. However, the birth would increase with population. It is in 1666 that nearly 2,000 of French came to settle. They would be named Canadian or companies of adventurers and later known as the Algonquin would be established. In 1701, the Peace of Montreal was signed, ending the conflict. In 1703, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed. France concealed part of its units the entire watershed of Hudson Bay to witness, in addition to mountain and Newfoundland, and to evacuate its presidential base. Since the beginning of the 17th century, the two world powers have been competing in the colonial territory and commercial plans. In 1754, the French and the British, battling for the Loire, they engaged in many wars known as the French in England. The first victories belonged to the French, whose allies were several indigenous groups. In 1755, the Acadians would be expelled because the British authorities feared that they would help the French groups. They would be replaced by reinforcements and British immigrants. In 1758, the British took possession of Louisville and went up to the St. Lawrence River, the city of Quebec and Montreal, the most important cities on the night of September 13th. The British took possession of the city of Quebec during the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Victory for the British. 2 months later, the city of Montreal will be capitulated. This puts the French and in France belongs to the British. In order to officially give the territory to the British, it was necessary to wait until the Second World War was ended. Between 1760 and 1762, the government will be established, which is named as the British. France is not as common as Quebec. The main economic activity of the territory.
Recording me while I sleep? They're not. I don't want people looking at me online. Gross.